Here we have one of those passages that is a little bit troubling in the fact that Paul is addressing bondservants who are slaves. This is chattel slavery. This is literally one person owning another. And instead of telling the slave they ought to run away, they ought to have an uprising, Paul had another strategy that represented, I think, the greater strategy of the church in the Roman Empire. And that is that if we're going to change the empire, they may have thought, we're not going to do it by force because we don't have the numbers. That had been tried and failed repeatedly in Galilee, for instance. Well, we're going to change the Roman Empire. Maybe we need to do it from the top down. That's not a bad strategy, except that at this time, the church really didn't have the political clout, Christians in key places, to make that happen either. So here's what the church did. The church created an environment within their gatherings and within their community of fellowship in these major cities in the Roman Empire, where slaves were not treated like slaves, they were treated like brothers and sisters. And this is precisely what Paul told Philemon. This little tiny book of Philemon is a letter that Paul writes to a slave owner. He's a leader in the church and he has a slave named Onesimus. But Onesimus had run away. Him and Paul, Onesimus and Paul, met up in Rome, and Paul sent Onesimus back. But when he sent him back with this letter that we now have, called Philemon, he tells Philemon to no longer treat Onesimus like a slave, but like a brother. And so that reveals the strategy that the church had in the first century that was a bottom-up, grassroots strategy. And it started by changing the hearts of Christians towards issues like slavery, and then legislating within the church, within the community and fellowship of Christians inside of these cities against such things like slavery. And these rules, laws, codes of conduct are called doctrine. And the doctrines of the church were first the codes of conduct, the laws and the procedures and the policies that were implemented by Paul and other church leaders that governed the behavior of the people within the church. And what ultimately happened in the Roman Empire through that process is as people's hearts were changed individually, and then the community called the church began to practice an alternative culture, one that is arising from the kingdom of God in their heart and in their fellowship, that culture became so attractive that more and more people in the Roman culture wanted to join the church culture. And when that happened, a movement began. We call that a grassroots movement, and it was a bottom-up movement. Now, in order for them to change the laws of the Roman Empire, they knew that force was out of the question. They didn't have the numbers for that, and they really didn't have enough political clout to be able to change it from the top down. So what did they do? They worked with what they had. They changed people's hearts and minds individually, and then the community of believers called the church, they lived an alternative lifestyle, one of holiness, goodness, love, and compassion. And in that community, in that alternative culture, slaves were not slaves, they were brothers and sisters. But what about these unconverted owners? What about the slaves in the church that still were owned by people outside the church? Well, what do we do about that? And that's what Paul's addressing here. And what's amazing is this, that in the worst human condition that we could possibly think of, slavery, Paul still assures them that they have a kingdom purpose. I mean, isn't that beautiful? That even in the worst situation, the darkest of nights, in the most horrible circumstances, Paul says you still have a kingdom assignment. You still have a purpose in the church. God still wants to use you. So he lays out some codes of behavior for these bondservants. And then he ends this passage so poetically, that they may adorn the doctrines of God, their lifestyle, the way they treat their masters, who may abuse them, but they're going to treat them right. They're not going to return evil for evil, taking the teachings of Jesus and fleshing them out on the earthly level. And Paul says, you've got a kingdom assignment, you've got a kingdom purpose, even if you're a slave. And when you conduct yourself according to the rules, the codes, the principles, the policies that came from Christ and is now implemented in the ecclesia, when you do that, you will be adorning the doctrines of God. Isn't that beautiful? That a slave can be a pearl necklace, that a slave could be diamond earrings, that a slave could be beautiful silk apparel. And all of the things that we use to adorn the human body, all of the things we use to adorn our homes and to adorn public spaces, that's what you can be if you live right, if you think right. And lo and behold, that strategy worked. The church conquered Rome. And if you go to Rome, the evidence is still there. Oh, and if you go anywhere else in the world, the evidence is still there. That started with some slaves, some common people that decided there's a king that they owe allegiance to and that they're going to live by a different code. Yeah, that is living a life that works.